Run back, Chapter 7, Free for All. Wally stood motionless in the hallway as his mother closed the door. Well, they must certainly have enjoyed that cake to eat it all in one meal, she said. She turned the plate over in her hands and then frowned. Oh my goodness, the plate's cracked. You'd think they would have taken better care of it, wouldn't you? Wally started to tell her what happened to the plate, but then he stopped. If he said any more, he'd have to explain why the girls had thrown it in the river. And if he told her why they threw it in the river, he'd have to tell them about the dead fish and the way he had banged Caroline's nose in class. Oh, well, they probably just fed it to the dog, he said lamely. Mother wheeled around. Wallace, I do not know what's gotten into you lately. All you boys have been on edge. Maybe you don't have enough to do. Maybe you need to do a few extra chores around here. Oh boy, thought Wally as he went upstairs. This evening sure hadn't turned out the way he wanted. He and his brothers had a pretty good laughing fit when they watched Caroline out in the river trying to find the plate. He never thought she'd find it, and the boys would have waited around if they hadn't remembered that dinner was on the table. Wally laid on his stomach on his bed and stared down at the braided rug. Ordinarily, he would have tried to figure out just how the little loops of orange got hooked onto the loops of green, like where it all began and which piece you'd have to pull first if you wanted the whole thing to unravel. But now, he was too mad at the Malloys to give it much thought. He'd like to pull a loop on the Malloy sisters, that's what, and watch them come apart for once. He'd like to see them pack their bags and take off out of town at 70 miles an hour. It just wasn't like it was when the Bensons lived in Buckman. Back then, they always signed each other's notebooks on the first day of school, the Hapfords and the Bensons. They'd give each other nicknames for the year, and one time they all had taken the names of football players. That was the year Wally had been Joe Montana. Things were sure were different now. Caroline in her black and blue nose, Eddie in that dumb baseball cap, and Beth in those ridiculous books she reads. She'd left one on the steps a few minutes at recess, and Josh had reported that he'd seen the cover. Fang, King of the Vampires. What kind of girl would read a book like that? Weirdo was right. When the Hatford boys were ready for school the next day, they watched until the Malloy girls were across the bridge and well up the sidewalk before they set out themselves. Do you see what's happening? Does anybody see what's happening? Jake grumbled. They're running our lives. They've only been here 1 week and already we can't leave for school when we want. We have to make sure that they've already gone ahead of us. Yeah, and Mom thinks they're nice. They're poison, said Josh. Wally did not turn around in his seat once to look at Caroline that day, and she didn't bother him at all. No blowing on the back of his neck or whispering in his ear. At lunchtime, he sat as far away from her table as he could get. And when he left at the end of the day, Mrs. Applebaum said, "Thank you, Wally, for being such a good listener today." He could have puked. Jake and Josh and Peter were waiting for him when he came out. Josh had a big smile on his face. "What have you got to grin about?" asked Wally. "At recess this afternoon," said Josh, I went inside real quick for a drink of water, and when I came out again, there's Beth on the bottom step reading that ridiculous book. The one about the Fang King of the Vampires?" Wally asked. "Yeah, that one. I had my jacket tied around my shoulders, and when I spread out my arms, I looked like a giant bat. And all I did was come slowly down the steps behind her, and she screamed her head off. I didn't even touch her. It was the best." Wally and Peter and Jake all laughed. "Did you get caught?" asked Wally. "No, but boy was she mad. She said this was exactly the kind of thing that gives her nightmares. And I said, well, why do you read books like that if they give you nightmares?" "It's ridiculous." "Ha," said Jake. Home again, Wally had just poured himself a big glass of high-C juice, and the boys were making peanut butter and cracker sandwiches when the phone rang. Wally answered. "Listen," came his mother's voice, and she was beginning to sound like Mrs. Applebaum. "Your father was talking with Mrs. Malloy this morning on his route, and she wondered who she could hire to wash their windows. Dad told her you boys have more time on your hands than is good for you, and that you'd come over after school to help. Now, I don't want you boys to take any payment for washing their windows." Wally yelped. "Oh, Wally," said his mother. "It's not fair," he shouted. "They've got 3 girls. They can wash windows. Eddie can climb up a ladder as well as any of us, and she's even taller than Josh. Besides, I've got plenty of things to do." "Name one," said his mother. Wally just stood there speechless. He didn't have any homework to do. He didn't play on any team. He didn't need a haircut. He did, of course, want to see how long it took for a waffle box to go around the river, but that wasn't a good excuse. "Wallace Hatford, you and your brothers have yourselves a stack and get over to the Malloy's house. With the 4 of you working, you could have their windows done in no time, and it's the least we can do for our new neighbors. Why, when we moved in, the Bensons came over and helped us wallpaper the dining room. I'll never forget it. And I don't want to hear any arguments from you boys. Get over there." The receiver clicked, and Wally stood staring at the phone in his hand. He didn't have to tell the others. They'd already heard. "We've got to wash their windows." "Oh my gosh," said Josh. "Yep," said Wally. "I'll bet Caroline put her mother up to this. I bet she went right home and told her how much we wanted to help. And Dad probably said, oh, well, that we'd do it for nothing." "Oh, I'll wash their windows all right," muttered Jake. "I'll put out their lights, curl their hair, and knock them into the middle of next week." "Gosh," said Peter. "Well, they're just getting so cocky," said Jake. "Those girls think they can get away with anything. They need a really good scare, that's what. Then maybe they'll just leave us alone." "But how?" said Peter. Everyone turned and looked at Wally. "Oh, I'll think of something," Wally told them. By the time they finished their snack and headed off towards the Malloy house, the boys had given up any idea of trying to scare the entire family. But they were convinced that they could scare Beth half out of her mind, and the thought of it, the vision of it, the sweet taste of victory in their mouths made the idea of washing all the Malloy's windows worth it. Every window. It would have been better, of course, if Caroline, Beth, and Eddie were not smirking at them as they came across the lawn. If they were not, in fact, sitting on a blanket out on the grass, sunning themselves with cookies and soft drinks beside them, ready to enjoy the show. "I'm so glad to meet you," said Miss Malloy, coming down the steps. "Your dad said you were the best window washers around, and I think it's wonderful the way you offered to help us." Wally didn't know whether he imagined it or whether he really did hear a snicker from Caroline. "Well, you do know each other, don't you, kids?" Miss Malloy went on, motioning to the girls on the lawn. "Eddie, Beth, Caroline, this is..." She paused, waiting for the boys to say their own names. "Josh," said Jake. "Jake," said Josh. "Peter," said Wally. "Wally," said Peter. Wally could hardly keep from smiling. Caroline looked at him and then at her mother, but she didn't say anything, and Wally knew why. If the girls squealed, the boys would tell on them about the cake. Even Stephen. Mrs. Malloy turned towards the house. "All right, we have these to do, as well as the storm windows there in the garage. We might as well do them all." Wally stared in dismay. There were 20 windows, at least on the house, which meant 20 storm windows, plus there were 20 more stored in the garage. This time, he heard a definite snicker from Caroline. The girls will help, of course," said their mother, and Caroline's smile disappeared. So did Beth's and Eddie's. What you boys can do is get the ladder from the garage and soap each window. Eddie can turn on the hose, and then she can rinse them from below, and you can dry them after that. Beth and Caroline will change the water whenever you need it changed, and they'll get you some clean rags. With all 7 of you working together, I doubt it should take more than a couple of hours. And then I'll have donuts and cider for you when you're done. When Mrs. Malloy went inside for the bucket and rags, Jake looked over at Eddie. "Nice going," he smirked. Eddie tossed her head and looked away. The old garage leaned a little to one side, but Wally didn't mind. It was his favorite place on the Benson's property, and he and his brothers and the Benson boys used to play in there for hours. For a time, they'd turned it into a clubhouse, and other times it had become a hideout. It was dark and musty with loose boards that creaked in the wind. He and Jake carried the ladder from the garage and put it up to the first window of the house where Mrs. Malloy was pointing. Eddie glumly got out the hose, and after Mrs. Malloy supervised the cleaning of the first window, she went back inside. Which window is yours, Eddie? Josh said. I'll be sure to leave lots of smudges on it. Har har, said Eddie. The reason the work went so quickly was because no one spoke much after that. Wally had read once about an order of monks who went about their work in silence and never spoke except for 1 hour on Friday evenings. This must be what it was like to be a monk, he decided as he carried the last of the storm windows out of the garage, except that there wouldn't be any girl monks around. Josh did the climbing of the ladder. Beth kept them supplied with clean water and rags. Jake and Wally carried storm windows in and out of the garage. Eddie hosed them off, and Caroline and Peter wiped the storm windows clean. In and out, up and down, back and forth. Mrs. Malloy had been right about one thing. The work did go faster with so many of them helping. Once, as he passed Caroline, she looked so cheerful he was about to tell her about the monks who never talked except for an hour on Fridays, but then he remembered she was the enemy. So he told Jake instead. Hey, if there were girl monks, you know what they'd be called? He asked, grinning. Monkeys. Jake laughed out loud. It was then that it happened, but no one knew quite how. It might have been Jake's laugh that made Eddie turn with her hose in her hand, but as she did, the water made a loop in the air and caught Josh up on the ladder. His bucket came crashing to the ground with a splash, 2 inches away from Beth, soaking her to the skin with brown, nasty water. Ugh. While Wally stared, Beth pushed a sponge in Jake's face, and Peter rushed to help his brother. Caroline went to help her sisters, and Wally simply tried to get the hose out of Eddie's hand. It was spewing water in every direction. The next great battle of the war had begun. Hey, what's this? Cried Miss Malloy, coming out of the house. Girls, you stop it right now. Wally, who had the hose now, was holding it upright like a pitchfork and realized that water was cascading down onto Miss Malloy's flower bed. As he jerked it away, he sent a stream of water across the porch, catching the girl's mother right in the face. Wally gasped. Sputtering, Miss Malloy rushed down the steps and turned off the faucet, and then stood there shaking water from her clothes. What on earth is this all about? She demanded. They started it, Mom, said Caroline, wringing out the tail of her shirt. We did not. Eddie turned the hose on Josh. He dropped his bucket on purpose, cried Beth. I did not, said Josh. Miss Malloy looked around curiously. You kids hardly know each other. How did you get to be enemies so soon? Wally looked at Caroline. I dare you, his eyes told her. No one spoke for a full minute. Oh, Mom, we're just fooling around, said Caroline. Yeah, we're just goofing off, said Eddie. Nobody's hurt, added Beth. Well, let's finish up the last window, and then y'all can come in and have refreshments. Good grief. For a moment, they all looked as though they were going to laugh, Wally thought. They did look funny, with their heads dripping water, their clothes soaking wet, and when Miss Malloy brought out the donuts and cider, they all sat on the steps to eat. He thought for maybe 1/5 of a second that the war might be over. That was before Miss Malloy went back inside, however. That was before the boys started home, because they had not gone 10 feet from the house when suddenly, biff, pow, splat, pop, went 2 wet rags and 2 soggy sponges hit the boys on the backs of their necks, and when Wally and his brothers wheeled around, the Malloy girls were disappearing inside the house, and the door slammed shut. That does it, said Jake. We gotta do something. What's the scariest thing you can think of, Wally? We're gonna start with Beth. Have you thought of anything yet? And as always, Wally said the first thing that came to his mind. Floating heads. Oh, you mean like we used to do with the Bensons on Halloween, said Jake, his eyes lighting up. Wally, you're brilliant. It's perfect. Oh my goodness, floating heads. Why didn't I think about it? Oh no, said Peter, this is gonna get crazy. All right, that's the end of chapter 7. I can't wait to hear about floating heads next on chapter 8. I love everyone. Mwah. I hope you're gonna have a great weekend.